Good evening, everyone. We're so thrilled to see so many folks out on such a chilly, wet night. This is absolutely amazing. I think it's a reflection of our terrific program tonight. I'm Lucy Dalglish. I have the honor of being the Dean of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. And I would like to introduce you to the President of the University of Maryland, Wallace Lowe.
Good evening, and welcome to the 12th Annual Shirley Povich Symposium on Sports Journalism. History will record that on a dark, rainy night, we had the largest turnout ever for a symposium.
Oh, is that right? Good job out of you.
And because we have all these luminary panelists, probably the greatest group of sports journalists ever assembled, this room will light up.
Not counting Super Bowls, Final Four,
So,
World Series.
thank you, Lucy. She is one of the great deans of one of the great colleges of journalism in the country. Let me just say that I think it was Howard Cosell who once said that sports is a microcosm of life. Because all of the big issues in society of race and gender and justice and ethics and politics and money, they are all mirrored in sports. But I wonder if sports is larger than life. I mean, millions of people of all ages either participate or are spectators of sports. Millions, if not billions of dollars, fuel that enterprise. If there were a national popular religion, it would be sports. Because when I look at the newspapers, including the Washington Post, there is more coverage of sports every day than there's coverage of education, culture, and books. In that sense, I don't know if sports is a positive moral force or whether it's a symptom of moral decline, but sports is absolutely a central part of our life, and it is with great honor that we have together this distinguished panel to talk about the biggest issues of sports today. Thank you for coming tonight.
Happily.
The Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism is absolutely integral to life at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. And we are so grateful to the Povich family that has endowed the center. Tonight, we are honored to have, in addition to Maury, Maury's brother David and his wife Connie, Maury's sister Lynn Povich, the author and magazine editor extraordinaire, and Maury's wife, Connie Chung, a distinguished class of the Merrill College class of 1969. The Povich Center has programs throughout the year, a summer camp, a winter workshop for high school students. If you would like to become more involved with the events at the Povich Center, on the back of your program, there is a form. Please give us your email address, and as you're walking out tonight, leave it on the table. And we will be sure that you get information about the programs as they come along. I would now like to introduce the director of the Povich Center for Sports Journalism, George Solomon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lowe. I, too, tell Dean Dalglish that sports is life, and she responds what you did say, it could be morally corrupt. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here. The first Povich Symposium took place in 2003 at the downtown D.C. Jewish Community Center, and our guest was Bob Costas, and Maury Povich was the moderator of a two-person panel, and it was great. But the way I see it, if Costas returns every 14 years, we'll see you here in 2031. And also, I appreciate Dean Dalglish mentioning the Povich Center. We will accept checks on your way out if you're really so inclined. But I want to thank you for being here. Shirley Povich was a great man. He was a sports columnist at the Washington Post for 75 years. He wrote great columns. He had great ethics. He had great qualities. He set standards in ethics. He set standards in everything in sports journalism. And we try to teach that here. And we have students who best exemplify that. And for that, we thank you. We do this in his memory. Thank you very much. And now on to Maury Povich.
Okay. Thank you very much. One of our panelists isn't here. None of us here are surprised he's not here.
He'll be here.
But he'll be here. But, you know, he beats to his own drummer, as does Mr. Kornheiser.
But mine usually arrives on time.
As George mentioned, it was 14 years ago, 2003, and we're going to use that year as a jumping off point as to what sports was like then, sports media was like then, and what it's like now. The Florida Marlins, for instance, I think won the World Series in 2003, and not only was Bob covering that, but he was prepping for the 100th year of the Olympiad in Athens, Greece, the following year. But the biggest news back then was the Balco investigation with Bonds, A-Rod, and all the others in baseball that was giving it a black name. In the NFL, the average salary was about $1 million. It is twice that now. The league was devoid of protests, no reports of CTE, domestic violence. The TV ratings were at an all-time high. 14 years later, those areas, as Michael Wilbon will tell you, for example, has said that his 9-year-old son will not play tackle football. In the NBA, the average salary was $1 million. It's rather $4 million. It's now $6.5 million as an average salary. LeBron was a phenom, not the best player in the NBA, which he is now. The popularity of basketball has grown exponentially more than the other major sports. And as for hockey, the less said, because the best team in hockey has yet to make it to the Stanley Cup Finals. As for the media, the Washington Post was then a family-owned newspaper. It was making money. Digital, online, the web, a distant thought. Sports pages back then had their own section. They weren't put back into the back of the business section. They actually had their own section and were thick. Horse racing, golf, tennis, boxing, they had their own beat writers then. No more. No paper in the United States, maybe except the New York Times, has a guy who writes golf or horse racing. ESPN was the most important station on every cable channel, on every cable box, as well as DirecTV. We know that ESPN, as to what it's doing today. There was no such thing as Barstool, Deadspin, Bleacher Report, the NFL Network, the NBA Network, the MLB Network were all in the future, as were the Big Ten and the SEC. With that in mind, I would like to welcome our guests. Christine Brennan has been the US Today's national sports columnist. I can't believe this, 20 years. 20 years. And before that, 12 years at the Washington Post. And Wilbon will say he's responsible for Christine because he apparently told George Solomon to hire her after she was covering sports at the Miami paper. She was the first woman reporter to cover the Washington Redskins. And she's covered many, many, many Olympiads, along with Bob Costas, of course, which she still does. She's written 7 books. She's in the Sports Hall of Fame at Northwestern, and she's on the Board of Trustees, which Wilbon is too, but he never told me that. Bob Costas has been with NBC Sports 38 years. He has covered every single major sport. He has worked along with, how about the 12 primetime host Olympics. That's Bob's background. He recently kind of cut back, and he's maybe even looking to retirement at NBC. Who knows? They still pay him. That's very good. But
we'd like that to continue.
Yes. But the joy of his life, and always has been, is Major League Baseball, and he's the prime network MLB announcer, along with many great athletes, and he does that every single year. He's just returned from one of the great series, the 7-game series with Houston and Los Angeles. He is truly a remarkable man when it comes to my first profession, which was sports broadcasting, and he has done everything more than anybody else, I think, in sports broadcasting to give it class. Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you. And also, one of my fondest memories was in the late 80s when Bob used to do a network radio show on Sunday nights called Costas Coast to Coast. He had me and my father on for the entire show.
Yeah. And am I allowed, at your expense, to use my line?
Of course.
It only popped into my head now, and you set yourself up for it. I mean, you
Okay.
threw the batting practice fastball. I said, I'm sitting here with Shirley Povich, and it strikes me, here is a man who actually knew Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, Jack Dempsey. And here is Maury Povich, who actually knows Joey Buttafuoco. Despite that, Maury is a great man as well.
Thank you.
Tony Kornheiser, fortunately, has been with us in the Washington metropolitan area, Washington-Baltimore metropolitan area, since 1979, after stints at Newsday and the New York Times. He is remarkable. He's insufferable. He and Wilbon do this show called PTI, which is the #1 studio show and has been for the last 16 years on ESPN. And they just keep collecting Emmys, which, by the way, Costas has a whole house full of. But he now does his podcast, which it comes out of a restaurant called Chatter, which he talked me into buying, along with the socialite Alan Bubis and the great Maryland basketball coach Gary Williams.
We're open now. If you get bored, we are full service and for profit.
He and Michael, by the way, were just honored, and I was so honored to I don't know why I was, but I happened to one of the guys who introduced them as the highest award at the National Press Club, the 4th Estate Award. And I always said, I don't understand this. You've got Scotty Reston, you've got Eric Severide, Walter Cronkite, you've got all these people, Shirley Povich, all these people who've won this award, and now you're down to Wilbon and Kornheiser. All right. So, let's start this way. Those sports that I mentioned, plus the media coverage. Christine, what's been the biggest change in the last 14 years? Is it one of those sports? Is it media coverage? What is it?
Well, it's a great question, Maury, and all of you students here, and I think the room is mostly students, a majority of students, you're going to be continuing to figure out what these next changes are, and we all encourage you to do that with honor and grace and getting it right and doing it by the numbers and by the book, as I think all of us up here have done. But to me, Maury, social media and the speed with which things happen, you know, it used to be the news cycle, what George was, well, I guess it was 12 hours or something like that. And you would wait, all of you, all of us would wait till the newspaper would hit our doorstep that morning. And all the journalists would get a good night's sleep, and whatever happened in the middle of the night, there wasn't a darn thing you could do about it. And now, of course, the news cycle is what, 15 minutes, maybe 10? So everything is sped up. We know everything quicker. I personally love that as a journalist, to have that vehicle, the tool, Twitter, to be able to break those stories. And I think all of us are enjoying, there's a lot of aspects of this, Maury, that we enjoy, that are really good. And for journalists, it's a delight to be able to have those that platform and those forums to be able to do that. But the flip side is the constant speed with which it happens. Another part of it, the athletes, of course, taking it upon themselves to tell their stories, so they don't have to come through us. Tiger Woods was one of the first to just say, go to my website, you'll see the statement there. And that, with Players Tribune, all of you, I'm sure, are well aware of that. So, but if you look at almost any of these things, whether it be domestic violence, whether it be the Colin Kaepernick story, steroids, anything you look at, it is moving at warp speed, and I think in large part because of social media. I'll leave it with this thought. That day that the Ray Rice video, I'm sure we all remember, maybe even you remember where you were when you saw the second video, not the first, but the punch, that awful punch 3 years ago, 3 years and 2 months ago. That was an ember at 10 in the morning. And by noon, it was a forest fire that had engulfed Ray Rice and the NFL. Ray Rice would never play another down in the NFL, and that was all because of social media and the reaction. And so I think that's a big part of the conversation.
So, Bob, is it good or is it bad, what she just said? Does that enhance things?
I think on balance, it's negative, although there are many positives. The various issues in sports which you laid out, we could dig into each of them and spend the entire session here just digging into each of them. I'll confine it to one because I think it's the one that has the most overarching meaning. Baseball had a steroid crisis. I'm not saying that it's over with, but it's substantially tamped down. But you can play baseball without steroids. In theory, although we won't live to see it, you could align academics and athletics and play college sports and have them be a legitimate extension of a university rather than something that is too often a sham. That's possible. You can play hockey without mindless fights. They do in the playoffs, they do in the Olympics, they do in college. There are issues, including, although it's a serious issue, the protests going on now in the NFL. Those issues come and go. The issue that is most substantial, the existential issue, is the nature of football itself. Once the juggernaut of American sports, unquestioned in its popularity, like a cash machine, faces the simple fact that Michael Wilbon is walking into the room and ladies and gentlemen, Michael Wilbon of the Washington Post and ESPN, who needs no further introduction.
Correct. Because his punishment is, I'm not going to give you an introduction.
That's good. I like that.
So go ahead.
But
now we're hanging on tenterhooks.
Sorry, Bob.
No problem. The nature of football is this. Unless and until there is some technology which we cannot even imagine, let alone has been developed, that would make this inherently dangerous game not marginally safer, but acceptably safe. The cracks in the foundation are there. The day-to-day issues, serious as they may come and go, but you cannot change the basic nature of the game. I certainly would not let, if I had an athletically gifted 12 or 13-year-old son, I would not let him play football. I remember my dad taking me to see the 1962 NFL title game at Yankee Stadium. It was as cold as I've ever been in my life. We sat in the upper deck, and I still can't get over the fact that the wind-swept conditions kept Wyatt Tittle from throwing the 5 touchdown passes he otherwise would have thrown against the Packers, and the Giants would have won the game, but instead they lost 16-7. My point is not that I have this crazy notion that you hear on talk radio and in some right-wing sites that this is just another left-wing conspiracy to undermine something that's quintessentially American. There's a word for thinking like that. There's many words. One of them is bullshit, because that's what that is, okay? Bennett Amalu, who is credited with discovering CTE, and Will Smith portrayed him in the movie Concussion. Bennett Amalu's memoir is just out. Its title is wonderful. The Truth Has No Side. The truth is the truth. Some of the best people I've met in sports have been football people. But the reality is that this game destroys people's brains. And not everyone, but a substantial number. It's not a small number. It's a considerable number. It destroys their brains. And with every week, there's another Nick Bonaconti, or a story that comes out of the distant or recent past, or there's a Dave Duerson or a Junior Seau killing themselves in such a way that their brains can be retained and studied. That's the fundamental fact of football. And that, to me, is the biggest story in American sports.
Where are you going with that, Tony?
Mike and I talk about this all the time, that when I was young, when your dad was a primary columnist, when Red Smith and Shirley Povich and even Jim Murray, who's younger than them, was a primary columnist, what sports writers did when this mattered is they set their schedules by 3 sports. They set them by horse racing, by boxing, and by baseball. 2 of those are done. They don't exist anymore except for one day a year. I mean, and the, NBC does a great job on the Triple Crown, but the sport no longer exists.
It's the Derby.
Boxing doesn't really exist anymore except on pay-per-view, except every once in a while. And even then, and Mike and I say this all the time, there is that line from the movie Patton where George C. Scott looks out and he says, "My God, God help me, I love it so." And because we like boxing. Football's headed there. There's no question that football's headed for barges. And this is what happened to boxing. It's not going to happen this year, and it's not going to happen 5 years or 10 years. But Bob is right. At some point, the cultural wheel turns just a little bit, almost imperceptibly, and parents say, "I don't want my kid to play." And then it becomes only the province of the poor who want it for economic reasons to get up and out. And and if they don't find a way to make it safe, and we don't see how they will, as great as it is, as much fun as it is, and as much as Mike and I in our real dotage will say, "Wasn't that great? Wasn't that game great?" The game's not going to be around. It's not.
So, Michael, we talked about earlier, I mentioned earlier, that of all the major sports, the only sport whose TV ratings have soared exponentially in the last 14 years is pro basketball. So why? Where did that happen?
It's an easy answer, actually. It's stardom and social media. The stars of basketball are international stars, Maury. The stars of professional football are not international stars. I was at the 2012 Olympics in London, and there was a young woman who excitedly, from China, wanted to get into the basketball games, and she wanted me to help her. And I said, why do you think I could help you? She's like, "Because I watch you every week in China, do the pre-game show for NBA games." And we talked, and we walked to the venue. And I said to her, when she knew everything about every basketball team, player in the United States of America, watching games at 8 a.m. in China, and I said, does Tom Brady mean anything to you? And there was a blank look on her face, like, what are you talking about? And they knew nothing of Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers or any of them, because pro football doesn't exist outside our shores. Basketball and soccer do. And they exist in ways that are Football wants to distance itself and put a moat around itself, between itself and its fan base. It doesn't want to talk to them. Well, Tom Brady's available on Tuesdays to talk. Well, LeBron's available every damn day. He's available every day on Instagram, on Twitter, on whatever it is. It's not filtered, right? And so are a number of NBA personalities. And in this social media age, they connect with an international fan base. So do the soccer stars in a way that other sports aren't important. They're not relevant in the same way.
Although it might not be as widespread, baseball is an international sport as well. Huge numbers of Hispanic players, Asian players, Caucasian players, African-American players, although that percentage is lower than it used to be. Players of color, if you count Hispanic players of color have never been a larger percentage of baseball.
Absolutely. And so you see, the question is, how is baseball going to grow those stars? Like, is Altuve going to be a worldwide star in the same way that, as great as he is, pick up equivalent player? If Altuve's not, he's not LeBron James. But
Mike Trout is not nearly as famous as Russell Westbrook, although you could make a case that Mike Trout's a better baseball player
in his,
than Russell
exactly.
Westbrook is a basketball
And
player.
so with that,
And by the way, a bigger market.
that's right. And so with that, with this change, another cultural change, very cultural, basketball finds itself in a place that I don't know could have been determined. It found itself there based on what else is going on in the culture.
Christine, I would be very frustrated if I was covering sports and I had to deal with social media in terms of this guy is out there on his own tweeting stuff. I can't get to him. I can't talk to him about that. He's his own reporter. He's creating his own coverage. How frustrating is that for a journalist?
Well, I hear a guy in the White House is doing that too. I love the way you said how frustrating is that, because I think it shows how far along we are in this process, and I don't know what the guys think about this, but that I don't even think of it as frustrating. I think of it as our reality. Now, does that not mean that we don't pick up the phone? And again, we're talking to the young journalists here. Pick up the phone and, as George used to say, surprise me. Tell us something we don't know. That's still out there. Absolutely, it's out there.
Is it possible for you all to surprise somebody?
Well, but it may not be. You have a great point about NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, Olympians. My goodness, as we're heading into a Winter Olympics, we're all watching certain people's Twitter feeds. So that's without a doubt. But
Costas isn't.
Well,
doesn't care.
Well, that's true.
But
yeah, well, I was going to say that. But just as a quick aside, last week the Zach Miller story and the terrible, gruesome injury that he suffered. I found a high school player who had that exact same injury. So I'm calling a high school kid and talking to his mom and his coach and him, and I'm having the time of my life like I did in the 80s, actually just writing a 1,000-word column for USA Today that's just about a kid who had his leg amputated and is now trying to play football again. So that's what I mean. Those stories are out there, but certainly at the big-time level, Maury, absolutely, it's a different ballgame.
generally speaking, and take into account generational biases, while there's a lot of good stuff, I'm not talking about what someone tweets in 140 characters, but there's stuff like The Ringer online. There are people who blog very thoughtfully online, but generally speaking, the best work is still in the Washington Post. It's still in Sports Illustrated. It's still in the takeout pieces in ESPN, the magazine. It's still on HBO's Real Sports. It's still on a good edition of 30 for 30. And game coverage is still, by and large, it may change because there's streaming stuff and new technology, but by and large, you turn on Al Michaels and Chris Collinsworth, you turn on Joe Buck and John Smoltz, you turn on Mike Breen to hear the NBA Finals. So the best quality and the largest audiences are still in the traditional places.
And their tweets gin up conversation. They give us more to talk about. And those guys they are more available. There are very few people who are not. They're more available because they understand the need to be out there, like boxers once did. What boxers were ever not available for comment? They were never not available for comment.
Ever since Ali. Everybody had to.
That's right. Well, so the people who do this, they understand that they need, they're public figures all the time now, and they accept that in a way the previous generation did not. Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant understand their publicness in a way that Michael Jordan would never have accepted. So, yes, they are the first sometimes to comment themselves through their own social media, but I think that we come in now, I mean, by the time Tony and I literally plug in to our producers, there are 1,000 things going on where nothing was going on at 1 o'clock in the afternoon for the previous 40 years.
I'm going to be contrarian on this.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I mean, I deliberately don't have anything to do with social media because I would lose my job. I mean, it's very obvious I would fire back at somebody, so I don't really pay attention to it.
You would hate anybody
Yeah.
who has comments
Sure.
on what you said.
Sometimes I read the comment sections on something that someone asks me to read, and it's appalling. It's so uncivil, it's absolutely appalling. So I stay away from that, but I am surprised and chagrined at how many good news organizations, television and print, take this stuff more seriously than I believe they should, and they go to comments by people, and you'll watch, and I do, because I watch the Today Show all the time, and they'll just randomly throw up comments by, Billy from Buffalo said, what? Well, who's Billy from Buffalo? Right. Now, you could say, well, who's Tony Kornheiser? Okay, but I have some sort of a resume that you can reject if you want to. But the notion of being quickest to respond to social media, to let social media determine the path that you're going to take because it's out there in however many characters it is for me, it's distressing, actually. So I stay away from it. But that's my way of saying, get off my lawn. And I understand that.
What would be distressing for me would be if your bosses read those comments and reacted.
Well, I think they do. I think in newspapers they do. And I think that they care very much.
Has anybody ever come to you and said, what you said the other day, or what you said last night, or what you said on the show a half an hour ago, we've been getting some very critical comments.
I'm going to give you an answer here and then try and move out of the way because I've taken up too large a proportion here, but this is a subject I feel strongly about. There used to be, and there still are, letters to the editor. The key word is editor. A good editor, if Michael wrote a column and 80% of the people disagreed with it and they had room for 5 letters, they would print 4 thoughtful letters in disagreement, 1 thoughtful letter in support. Now, and part of this is just a craven situation on the part of most newspapers, which are desperate to survive. Most newspapers either have gone away or they have shrunken to where they're almost like little pamphlets. So they've taken everything to the digital side. And a lot of writers have said to me, and maybe you guys have heard the same thing, that years ago my editor would say, good story, but you needed another quote from the mayor, or you needed something from the coach. Now the only thing we ever hear is, that got the second most clicks in the section. Well, here's a rhetorical question. If any of the 3 writers here could, and your life depended on it, write a story that would be nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, or write a story that's headlined 10 reasons why so-and-so is an idiot, and your life depended on which got the most clicks, it isn't even a question. 10 reasons why so-and-so is an idiot, even if none of those reasons point to anything except that the person who wrote it is an idiot. That's where it is, okay? And what happens is that as soon as the last punctuation, after Christine's column or Michael's column, as soon as the last punctuation, there are people out there trolling who become the first commenter, and they're almost always idiotic, vitriolic, utterly ignorant, worthless comment gets to in some way piggyback onto their column. Now that person, because the technology allows it, can blog, but why should a responsible news organization allow hundreds, if not thousands, of these comments, most of which have no redeeming value whatsoever, to be part of the the credibility and the accountability that has been built up over decades, if not more than that, by that publication. This is a sellout. It's something that, for the most part, the networks are protected from. They still haven't figured out a way that somebody can just declare themselves a blogger and all of a sudden they can beat Jim Nance or Al Michaels or Mike Tirico. It doesn't work that way. You still go through Doc Emmerich to get the Stanley Cup Finals, and that's because he's proven that he's the best guy to do the Stanley Cup Finals. So we don't have to be as desperate, although I will tell you this, that at the Olympics in Rio, they had a Facebook booth set up in the lobby of the NBC Hotel. And they tried to shepherd us to the Facebook booth to have our picture taken and to make some comment about the day in Rio. And I will edit Al Michaels' comment. Al said, I talk to 25 effing million people every effing Sunday, and I'm supposed to effing care about 15,000 effing more on Face effing Book? And you know what? He's effing right.
You know, if you can think about this, talking about letters to the editor, it used to be, and again, George, you know this well, there would be a letter to the editor, and they would have to put their phone number so that the newspaper could call them and confirm that they, in fact, wrote that is their name, and then they put Bethesda, Maryland, or whatever, and then they print it. Think of how far we have, well, plummeted, that we are now in the state that Bob has described, where people attach themselves to you, and there's a food fight. I don't even look at the comments under my column. And what I really concern, we can take it.
Yeah, but at the same time, Tony, as we just saw, heard, doesn't believe in any of that stuff.
Right, but
this guy right here is, he's a tweeter deluxe.
Well, but that's
but
different.
I don't read it. But I don't read.
Right. It's different than creating it yourself.
Just like there's a difference between athletes tweeting out, and we're talking about them being part of the story. They're commenting on their own lives. That's different than consumers. Yeah, I got 5 million Twitter followers. I don't understand why anybody follows me. But they do. This is the world we live in now, where people look in and say, I want to be, and Instagram is a whole different level. That is purely, I like your life and where you go and the velvet ropes you go behind, and can I participate in that? And so this is the world we now inhabit. And we're not just inhabiting it. We may just be getting used to it. I just launched an Instagram account about 2 weeks ago, because you cannot reach. If you're going to continue,
people are now going to Instagram than they are to Twitter,
and for different reasons. But when you look at all of this, the one thing that I am sure of, and the only place I differ with Tony, we don't differ. I hate these.
Oh yeah, you do.
No, we don't. You know why we don't, Maury? He knows I'm as much a get off my lawn person as he is, even though I'm 10 years younger. And
he has a bigger lawn.
I had a general manager of an NBA franchise one day when I was answering Twitter followers. I used to spend a half an hour if I had downtime in the airport, and God knows everybody has downtime in airports. I would spend those 30 minutes before boarding a flight answering people, because the questions were fairly reasonable. They were sometimes insightful. People were curious. Why not engage, right? I was going back at somebody, and I had an NBA GM, probably saved my career, because he called my cell phone while I'm answering people on Twitter. And he said, stop. Stop now. You're going back at some moron. You're going to get fired. Stop doing this. And I thank him all the time for doing that, for intervening. But what I do now is I will tweet, yes, as you know, I don't follow anything much and anybody.
You think there should have been somebody to tell Jameel Hill, don't do that?
Here's what well, just real quick on Jamel, and we're all, I think, fans of Jamel here for sure. I've mentored her years ago, newspaper person for years. She's got a TV show, and I would have loved to hear her do a 5 to 10, 15-minute conversation, well thought out, maybe on teleprompter, where she's written it and she's put it out there about, is Trump a white supremacist? That Twitter is great for, I think, bulletin board stuff, for me, like posting a column, posting a TV appearance. But when you've already got that wonderful forum, right, use that, Jamel. That's what I firmly believe.
And don't punch down and get into an exchange with somebody. It's like the old George Bernard Shaw observation. It's like wrestling with a pig. You get dirty and the pig enjoys it. So if you're Jamel Hill and you've got a show, I said exactly the same thing. I wasn't cribbing off of Christine. The day after it happened, I would happen to be on Bill Maher, and I said exactly the same thing. You got your own television show. Use it. Use it to good effect. There's one more thing, and then hopefully you'll go in whatever direction you want to go. In addition to the incivility of it, which Tony talked about, I don't think even the average person who's not directly involved, even an intelligent, sophisticated person, recognizes how much of this stuff is just flat out false. Is it snarky? Yeah, there's a difference between snark and irreverence. Is it awful and mean-spirited? Has it coarsened our culture? And when it comes now from the very top, has that coarsening been placed on steroids? Yes, but I don't think people realize how much of what's out there is just flat false. And this is not get off my lawn. It doesn't matter whether we would prefer to hold a newspaper, an actual broadsheet in our hands with a cup of coffee in the morning, and someone else gets it off a tablet or off a device that they'll invent tomorrow. That's just a generational preference. But there are, or should be, enduring verities. Truth matters. Accountability matters. Context matters. Fairness matters. And if it was a lie and it came off Gutenberg's printing press, it's a damn lie. And if it's a lie and somebody blogged it or commented it or it's on some half-ass site, it's still a lie. But if it's good and I have to go through some technology that I don't understand and I have to get my kids to help me get there, if it's good and it's insightful, then it's just as insightful as if Shakespeare wrote it on a piece of parchment paper with a quill pen.
He's good, isn't he?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know I referred earlier to the students in the room. I think I know some of you, and I've certainly talked to some of your classes. And I am concerned, Maury, about this exact topic for all of you. This can really wear you down. And one of the things, this is going to sound like kind of basic, probably veering into too much more of a inside the business kind of conversation, but to have your roommate or your sister or your brother or your cousin go through your Twitter mentions and just get rid of those people. Don't let this stop your beautiful lives for one moment. Your careers are just beginning.
You don't know what that means, do you?
No.
I didn't think you did. You have no idea what that means.
No.
But to
And
get
you know what? It's a great country, and I don't have to. I don't have to. Because we're working. You know?
Still.
But he knows what she's talking about.
Yeah,
Twitter mentions.
Well, especially if you are covering for the Diamondback and you do a tough story on the football team or men's hoops or women's hoops or whatever you're covering, and all of a sudden you're starting to get killed because people have read it and they're mad at you, and that can be tough. It can be tough when you're 20 or 21 or 22, and that's what I'm talking about, because we don't want your career to stop before it starts.
Well, Christine, you're right, first of all. But if careers stop because you worry about that, you better find another career.
But Mike, it's tougher. We
It's-
did not.
you know what?
We didn't get that.
You know
when
what?
we were
You
starting.
didn't get that.
Well, but
I got
letters.
and have to show to you the kind of hate mail that exists now. Lynn Shapiro knows it because he would try to protect me from some of it.
Well,
I got all that mail. I got worse. As bad as it is today, maybe you guys don't know it. I got worse mail in 1981 when nobody had seen a black sports writer in most places.
I believe that.
Okay, I got worse mail in 1990 when I was one of 5 black columnists in America. 1990, like his goddamn Jackie Robinson. 1990.
Right.
I got worse mail. The mail's not as bad now. The comments at the bottom of my column, if I write for The Undefeated or if I write for ESPNChicago.com, not as bad today as they were then. Okay? So, yes, the discourse is awful. He knows I've been calling this the Simon Cowling of America for 20 years as soon as I saw that SOB on television. and doing what he was doing and lowering the bar for conversation. Did I not start that then, decrying this? Yeah.
Yes.
But Mikey,
So, hold on, Chris. So,
okay.
I sort of like Simon Cowell.
Yeah,
I
I
liked
know.
Idol for the first 5 years.
So, that was where I thought the beginning of it was. The beginning of it was the permission to do this, to humiliate people on national television and become the #1 rated show. That was going on in 1990, whatever it was, and the opinions expressed have only gotten worse, except for some of us, they were already worse.
Right, Mike, I just would like to just add, we're talking about letters. I got a lot of those as the first woman. You know, George, Lenny, you put us all on these things too. I'm not minimizing that, but I'm saying now they attach themselves to all of us, especially young people, and it's public. And their mom can read it, their dad can read it. George, you and I looked at some of those terrible letters I got or that Mike got, and you threw them away or you dealt with them. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make. The public nature of it.
I don't disagree with that. And just in
The
this
letters we
regard.
got?
No. The sense I think people, I think you're a product of where and how you grow up. I think you're tougher now. I think people are tougher now. I think they accept that these things happen all the time. That's part of the price for the position that you take. And I doubt they're as bothered by it as you were or I was. I mean, the analogy to me would be, and Bob will appreciate this, you know, I would say to my children when free agency came along in baseball, and I say, it's got to be terrible for you because you can't root for the same person for 6 years or 8 years or 10 years like we could. And they go, what are you talking about? It didn't matter to them. It was the reality of their lives. And that will be the reality of the people who go into journalism as a profession now. They will understand that this is what comes back at you, and they will be able, if they're strong enough and good enough, to say, okay, that's part of the deal, and we'll just move on. I agree with Mike in that people will get tougher. They'll get tougher.
One more point, which I think everybody here understands, and many people out there understand, but perhaps not to the extent that they should. When people are getting primary information about politics or whatever from Facebook, or when the President of the United States says, which they are, President of the United States says, I heard this somewhere, could be from commenter 6 on Breitbart, or a tweet someplace, all right? Many of you have seen the very effective, I think, CNN ads. This is an apple. You can look at it from left or from right. People can say it's a banana. They can say it's a banana in all caps, and they can say banana, banana, banana. But this is an apple. Now, you can have a different perspective on the apple, but I've never thought that George Will was lying to me. I thought he was viewing facts from an honest conservative perspective. I do not think that Nicholas Kristof is lying to me. I think he's viewing a set of facts from an honest, more liberal perspective. I do believe that a huge percentage, especially of what's out there on the internet, is people consciously lying, misleading, mischaracterizing, because it is their business model. It is not simply a case of here's a legitimate conservative viewpoint or a liberal viewpoint. It is a business model of many of these sites, of cable stations, and of talk radio to incite the resentments and the existing biases and create echo chambers around certain sets of ideas and to push certain buttons. And that not only has left us misinformed, we are actively uninformed and actively angry to the point where we have now made it okay not just to disagree with somebody, but if I disagree with Michael Wilbon, I am at liberty, according to this ethos that's been created, to demonize him as a human being. Because if I disagree with him, how could he possibly be a good guy? How could he possibly be a nice man, an honest man, a good friend? Well, I've had friends my whole life with whom I differ politically, but who I'd count on in a pinch because they're good people. But the way the media now works and the way the business of the media works, we are being slowly taught, and it's corrosive, to dislike and demonize those with whom we disagree. And many times we only think we disagree with them because their actual views, and I can account for this myself because I'm not going to bore you with the details, but I didn't say what Fox News said or what Breitbart said I said about guns. I didn't say anything like what they think I said about Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump did, but that didn't matter to them. It isn't just that they demonize you. They start out by mischaracterizing or lying about you, and then they double down and demonize you.
So, but these two guys spend a half hour, 5 days a week, going at each other with opinions and maybe dumping on people, but you all do it. I don't want to say fun, but we all know this is entertainment.
Yeah. Hopefully they find it entertaining. But but the other, I think, Bob spoke to this earlier about one, a resume, and two, one of the reasons I have to do this, if we're going to talk about the differences in media and perception, and he doesn't have to do this, I get out and go face the people I dump on.
Really?
Yeah, because I go in locker rooms every week. Every week.
Yeah, well, he doesn't go in.
No, he hasn't been in a locker room.
I used to. I know what it's like.
He knows. I learned how to do it from him.
Yeah, when you wrote a column, the rule was if you wrote bad about somebody, you made sure your face was in that locker room the next time that team played, and that does not happen.
That's what
somewhat
bloggers
now,
don't have to do.
but not the way it used to. No.
Not with the people from Barstool.
No.
But that there hopefully is also a receptiveness there. I still do this, and I'm critical of whoever I'm critical of, but I'm not scared to face them.
Who held it against you? You ain't getting out of this, Michael.
Over years, you mean?
Yeah.
Plenty of people. I mean, I've had major disagreements over decades with somebody that I grew up with, Isaiah Thomas. He used to make fun of me for then sort of making up and apologizing for a position I took 10 years earlier. I did Russell Westbrook, not happy with my criticism of him. I'm pointing out basketball players are the easiest because those are the locker rooms I go in most frequently. And even people that I wind up agreeing with fundamentally, I have to sometimes disagree with them. Football coaches, people that we have on our show that we have disagreed with vehemently. So it happens as a matter of course. But I will say this, most of those people that we cover, they know they don't have to find us. And if they do want to look for us, they know where to find us, and that takes a lot of the anger away.
There's another part to that, though, and it would be crazy for us not to admit it. We have arrived at a level of visibility and perhaps fame that people, even who we criticize, are happy to talk to us, maybe to turn us around a little bit, because they think, well, we see these guys on TV every day, so we're going to talk to them. We don't have the difficulty that most people have of being able to have access to people that you have praised or criticized. I mean, we don't have that. People want to come on the show, or if they see us, even people that we've ripped, they come over, they put an arm around you, and if they mention that, they are basically good-humored about it. So, and you've had this happen to you, I'm sure, as well, that no matter almost what you say, as long as you say it civilly, as long as you take reason in the way you say it, they'll come over to you. They'll chat you up, and 10 years down the road, they'll think you were good friends.
And most people that we talk to, they actually know that they're not stupid. They know the difference between ridicule and criticism. And there is a difference.
Years ago, like 70 years ago, my father was, back then, the beat reporter on baseball games were the official scorers. So he gives the first baseman of the Washington Senators, Joe Kuehl, an error on a play. And my father goes down to the locker room after the game, and Kuehl takes a swing at him. Very upset. So Clark Griffith, the owner of the Senators, fines him $50. And a guy writes to Kuehl with $50. I would have given you another $50 if you hadn't have missed. So I guess that's confronting, right? Has anybody gotten belligerent with you all? Christine, anybody ever have?
Oh, all the time. Yeah. Agents, a lot, Tiger Woods agent. I was at Wimbledon, covering Wimbledon, 15 years ago, and the phone rings, and it's Tiger Woods agent screaming at me from my column last column I'd written about Tiger. I completely agree about hit and stay journalism. We could call it hit and run journalism, which I think a lot of our friends in the blogosphere, the guy that's blogging in Charlotte, North Carolina about the Seattle Seahawks, in his pajamas or something, he's never going to show up at Seahawks practice. But I think we all agree, because our pedigrees and our backgrounds are so similar, that you do show up. And so, for example, how does that work now? I've written a lot of columns about the National Football League. We've all talked a lot about the NFL, as Bob referred to earlier. And now a great little piece of the print side is that link appears almost instantaneously. And so I will usually send that off, or either let them know it's online, or even send it to, say, a public relations person that I was just dealing with, or a source, or my goodness, the commissioner of the NFL himself, who I've known for 30 years. And here's the column. Not because they get a chance to edit it, it's already online, but that's how we work. It's a two-way street. Here's my cell, and there's the column, and I want to hear about it if there's any problem. And that's how you survive and have a long career, in my humble opinion.
Do they get after you?
On occasion, and we've all had this experience too, sometimes they hear it from a third party.
Oh, yeah.
And it isn't what you said, it isn't what you wrote, and then you're easily able to set the record straight. I can just give you a couple of examples. It happens. Some 15 years ago, when I had the program on HBO, there was a memorable exchange with Vince McMahon, who had moved out of the wrestling world and briefly into the XFL and had partnered with NBC. And there are no commercials on HBO. The show was live, and it was like 25 minutes of unremitting tension. And I don't know how much of that was just Vince McMahon's wrestling character, how much was him actually angry, but his face turned crimson, and the veins were bulging in his neck and in the side of his head, and he kept coming forward toward me, and people thought that he might, squash me like a bug, which he could have. And it was funny afterwards, because when it was finally over with and he stalked off the set, the very next guest, as luck would have it, was Bob Knight. And I said, Coach, this is the one and only time when you're going to be the most genteel man in the room. But when the show was all over with, the cameraman said to me, hey, don't worry, if anything had happened, we had your back. But he was this close to me, and he kept coming closer and closer, and I knew what he was doing. He was trying to intimidate me, but I didn't think he was going to swat me. So when he came, and he outweighs me by 100+ pounds, and when he came closer, I just leaned forward and smiled at him, and that set him off even more. And he has taken, in the years since, to saying that he should have kicked my ass when he had the chance. And I will say, I think I recall that evening pretty well. Only one person got their ass kicked that night, and it wasn't me.
Right.
But there are ways other than physically that you can get your ass kicked, and I think he did. Another example, we all make uncharacteristic mistakes. I'm a reasonably good broadcaster. A few years ago, Pedro Strop, still pitching for the Cubs, walks off the mound after a terrible outing in St. Louis. And he kind of blesses himself and he points toward the sky. And I think we're not going to commercial. And I've been thinking for a while of what I thought was a pretty good riff if I could have gotten it off, which is, why are people always doing this after hitting a ground single to right field in the 8th inning of a game with their team losing 9-2? The base hit makes them 1 for 5 and raises their batting average to 237. So my whole thing was going to be, don't you think in a situation like that, that your dear departed Aunt Matilda, listening to angels floating on clouds and playing harps, would just as soon you leave her out of it until you get your batting average up over 250? That's what I had intended to say, okay? As Pedro Strop, who's the nicest guy you could meet, goes walking off. And all of a sudden, I hear 5, 4. And you know what? I'm not trying to put myself necessarily in this class, but Gold Glovers make errors. I kicked it. I said, Pedro Strop, pointing toward the heavens, perhaps asking some departed relative for forgiveness for this horrid performance. All right?
And as a Cub fan, I was watching the game and laughing my ass off.
Oh, thank you. But
I loved the line. I thought it was great.
Well,
I was tired of Stropey at that point.
It landed with a thud, okay? At least I thought so. So now the producer says to me, that came across more harshly than you thought. The Cubs were still in town the next day, and I did what you did before social media. You don't tweet out an apology. You don't say, I'm sorry if anyone was offended. You go into the Cub clubhouse the next day. You look Pedro Strop in the eye, or I look up to look at him, and I say, I'm sorry. I mean, he knew we had not met, but he knew I'm sorry. I was wrong. I screwed it up. I apologize. And he could not have been more gracious. He said, you know, people tell me you're a good guy. We all make mistakes. It's cool. Now, every time I see him, it's like an inside joke.
I think we're going to open it up for questions. Is that better? Sure. I think we've had our fill.
Yeah.
All right. So everybody, if you want to ask some questions, these three gentlemen and this prestigious lady have been around long enough that they've heard them all. So go at them. Yeah.
Thank you. I enjoyed your remarks about where sports is going in America over the next 20 years. Why do I buy a baseball team?
Why buy a baseball team?
Why do I buy a baseball
Well, I think there's a future for baseball.
Oh, yeah. The equity is great, and it's gone over the last 10 to 12 years from a $1 billion business to a better than $10 billion business with global reach and with additional sources of money from the internet and from MLB technologies and whatnot. So it's not a bad business.
Ask the Lerner family. They'll tell you. It's a very good business.
Why should I buy a football team?
Well, let me go back to baseball or football. If you have enough money to do that, Maury and I have a restaurant that will sell you.
Thank you.
Sell it?
Oh, God.
Yeah. Hey, been here since the mid-'70s. I'm very grateful to have seen you and read your writings, especially when you were columnist for the Washington Post. My question is, was it easier for you to cover a local team when they were excelling like crazy, and let's say like the Redskins in the early 80s, or when they're pathetic? And I'll ask
I'll ask
Tony.
them all.
I'll ask them all, yeah.
You root for two things. You root for a really good team or a really bad team. What you don't want is a mediocre team. What you don't want is a team that's 8-8 if it's football 5 years in a row, or between 6-10 and 9-7 and no impact whatsoever. It's much more fun to have a really bad team or a really good team, and it's much easier to deal with, and you get much greater response from people because really good and really bad is something you can talk about. I mean, without insulting any hockey fans here, that team that loses in the playoffs every single year before it's time to lose engenders much greater feelings than if you just made it once in a while, you know.
And in broadcasting, you'll want a great game. It doesn't matter.
Yes.
You just want a great game.
That's really all you want. Almost every broadcaster has faced this. People think Joe Buck was rooting against both the Astros and the Dodgers simultaneously. But no one has ever received a letter or now been at the receiving end of a tweet or an email that goes like this. Dear Mr. Gowdy, Summerall, Scully, Musburger, Buck, Costas, I am a fan of the Baltimore Orioles, and as such had no particular rooting interest in this past October's Astros-Dodgers World Series. However, in the interest of fairness, I found you to be appallingly prejudiced toward the Astros and unfair toward the Dodgers. No one has ever received a letter like that. However, we've all received letters that are exactly the same letter, just with different postmarks and with different teams that we supposedly hated, and they all watched the same broadcast and heard the same words. What broadcasters, network broadcasters, we're not talking about the voice of the Knicks or the voice of the Capitals or the Wizards. What network broadcasters root for is dramatic storylines. You root for the team that's losing to catch up. You root for a 7-game series. That's what you root for.
So how great was that Astros-Dodgers game?
One of the best I've ever seen. The only small letdown was that of the 7 games, the 7th game was the least compelling.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you guys for coming out. As speaking for all the students here, we're very grateful to have your expertise. This is more focused towards Mr. Wilbon. Mr. Costas, you touched on it earlier. If you have to choose between a Pulitzer Prize article and a top 10 list, people will click the top 10 list. I see one of these in the age of clickbait journalism. I see the villain at the end of the hallway being LeVar Ball. And I wonder, is this where journalism and sports media is headed, towards this kind of almost TMZ-like reality show towards these characters, or is this just the bottom of the iceberg per se, and it will resort back to the mean? Or do you see characters like this continuing to rise up, and this will become the new norm of people like
Boy,
this?
that's a thoughtful
That's a
question.
great question. It's the norm already. I mean, it is the norm. That's where we live. I mean, TMZ, I'm not going to say you can't separate them, but they've grown closer together and been in each other's orbit.
Tony loves TMZ.
He does. He watches in the newsroom. So, LeVar Ball is probably the exception for now. There are people clearly studying him.
Yeah, but he thinks he's Ali.
Of course he does. And and the sadness is what you're getting at. Are we going to be trending toward this? Are we going to have copycat LeVar Balls? And the answer is yes, because people want this. They think they can convert that interest into dollars for themselves. But this is not the first. But it is fundamentally different, at least to me, and I don't know if they'll disagree, fundamentally different from Richard Williams, from Earl Woods, from, who else am I leaving out?
Well, the tennis player's dad.
Yeah,
The other
Capriati.
one's Capriati.
Well, no, Capriati's dad.
Or even Jimmy Connor's mom.
Jimmy Connor's mom, Gloria.
Right.
So this is not the first. But what you've seen now, the thing I think that we don't have in this culture anymore, which is not, it doesn't set us apart, but it shows, it's reflected in our industry too. We don't have any shame. There's no shame anymore.
But there's a part of this. I mean,
None.
and I'll say this for Mike and myself. We don't have him on. We've never had him on.
And I
We're not
greatly
going to have him
appreciate
on.
that.
Other people have him on. We don't.
A brief comment about what Michael and Tony pioneered with PTI, and now there's, it seems like hundreds, probably only dozens of imitators. It's absolutely impossible for any thoughtful adult to be in a state of high dudgeon over a dozen different sports topics a day. These guys bring interest and humor to it. You cannot blame them for all the imitators. It'd be like blaming Alexander Graham Bell for call waiting. It's not the genius's fault that lesser beings took it in the wrong direction.
Yes. Thank you, Bob.
Dr. Tony, this one's for you. I'm a big fan of the podcast.
Thank you.
In fact, so much of a fan that I emailed your show last week and I asked if we could carpool up here tonight. And I
You
met
see
you
what he
here.
thinks of email, don't you?
Yeah, tell me about it. No, in all reality, this is my serious question. I'm bringing it back to current events. Just a couple hours ago, we found out about the tragic death of Roy Halladay. Can you, all of you, share an experience or a memory that you had of him, one that made a difference?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that we changed our show around for that. We were ready to tape a show, and we had, an order to the show and a rundown to the show. And then about 5 o'clock, right around 5 o'clock, we found out about the plane accident. And so we put it at the top of the show. Now we not only put it at the top of the show, but we didn't do the normal joke at the top of the show. Michael say something and I'll come out with a line that, believe me, is written for me, hopefully delivered well, because we thought this was a very serious topic. And it's not that we had that much to say, because we really didn't, but when you have a topic like that, you should be very sober in the way that you deal with it and talk about a person's records and just, in my case, of course, and you would have probably felt the exact same way, thought of Thurman Munson. Mm-hmm. And talked about that early in the show, that this is one of those things you inhale very, very quickly, and that was the memory that I had, more than Roy Halladay necessarily, because of the way that it happened. Yeah. I thought of Thurman Munson.
Bob, did you know him?
I knew him only to say hello to him. He pitched a no-hitter in the postseason, not the same thing as Don Larson's perfect game in the World Series, but in an earlier round playoff game, he pitched a no-hitter. The kind of pitcher who, for a period of time in his career, was as good as many Hall of Famers, but doesn't have the resume to make it to the Hall of Fame. But, you know, guys like Orel Hershiser or Brett Saberhagen or Dave Stieb and others I'm forgetting were, in the best 5 or 6 year chunk of their careers, as good as guys that are in the Hall of Fame. Nobody wanted to face Roy Halladay. I mean, he really was the full package, but like a lot of modern pitchers, his arm gave out, all of which is inconsequential alongside what happened today.
Yes.
I appreciated Bob's comments about the inherent dangers of football and whether the sport can be made safe. So my question for the panel is, what responsibility does the NFL have with regard to kids playing tackle football? Should the NFL be more aggressive in educating parents? And the NFL is a primary funder of youth football in the United States. Is that appropriate?
Christine, I mean, I know you've written a lot about it.
Well, and we should drag Mark Hyman right up here on this panel because he's written in books on this topic. Great to see you, Mark, and your students. And, you know, you bring up a great point because, of course, I think we're all wondering, what does football look like in 20, 30, 50 years? Do we have football in 50 years? And I think the only way that it really succeeds, as we've heard Bob say, his son wouldn't play, and you know, we all talk about if you had a son, would he play? And I think more and more people are saying no, especially suburban and families, I think, whether it's more urban or rural, we'll see. And again, you know this as well as anyone. But I think the only way football really survives is if the NFL does get involved, whether it's financial or otherwise, and make sure that kids learn the proper way. And maybe it's flag football for up until a certain age, and I know that's not very exciting. But I think there's a lot that could be done that right now it seems as if the NFL is trying to worry more about the PR aspect of it and to come clean on these issues and have a conversation about it. As I think someone said on the panel, football's not going away anytime soon. And if you watch those college football games the last few weekends, and Mike and I, our Northwestern Wildcats, 3 overtimes in a row, I mean, you can be as concerned about football as you want, and you can just be loving what's going on, especially on Saturdays or Sundays. So I think the reality is that there is a way to get this done, and to not, for the leagues and the governing bodies to not be afraid of it, but to address it head on. And again, your work has certainly led to that conversation. Whether these leaders want to do that, Mark, whether they want to really get in there and say, we've got a problem with head injuries, now let's look at the kids and figure out a way they can continue to play some semblance of this game. I'm not so sure they want to go there, but I think the only way they succeed 20, 30, 40 years down the road is to have that kind of conversation.
Real quickly, Mark, as a father of a 9.5-year-old, I don't believe the NFL owes us anything. It's up to parents. You know, I mean, they're running a business. Why should I think that they should work at cross purposes with their agenda? For what?
I mean, cross purposes?
Yeah, there are enough independent. I want independent thought. I don't need the NFL to tell me what to think. I know what the NFL thinks. They are to promote, Christine, their product. That's their job. If I owned a business, that's my sole, not my sole responsibility. Anything else is secondary, in my opinion. That conversation will be held in my house, as it has been. You know, luckily, my son said, Dad, are you going to ban me from football? And I said, do you want to play football? And he said, I don't want to get hit. Bingo! There we are. That was a real short conversation. And, you know, the one thing he likes to play is quarterback on the weekends. He can spin a football and throw the hell out of it. And it scares me if anybody else sees him do this. You know, but I don't think the NFL, you know, it's like, what is the NCAA OP? We know what their purposes are. We know what their agendas are. There are enough conversations that can be had independently. There are enough forces of change, you know, that these other purposes can be fulfilled without relying. Why do I think the NFL is going to tell me the truth? What would lead me to that conclusion? I don't need that. Now let's go other places. Look at the studies, my God, coming out of New England and University of Michigan, and I know someone at Mayo in Arizona who I talk to, I consult before we go on television about these issues. There are enough other sources that we don't need to rely on the NFL to tell us why we should consume their product. We should be able to, there are enough places that we can arrive at our own independent decisions, I don't know, 100 times out of 100.
As briefly as possible, and Mark, you know this, they keep saying we need more information. More and more information will become available. Yes, it will, and it won't be good for football. The more information comes out, the worse it looks. And what we know is that brain trauma, the younger the person is, the worse it is, because the brain is not fully developed until your mid-20s, especially the prefrontal cortex. And the longer you play tackle football, the more cumulative hits, in addition to the disproportionate impact on a young person, leads you to the common sense conclusion that if you're going to play tackle football, you shouldn't play tackle football at all until you're 18 years old, but at a minimum. But then, where is the talent pool for college? What happens to college football? The whole thing could collapse like a house of cards if people actually begin connecting the dots.
Yes.
Thank you. So you mentioned trolls in like your comment section in social media. So my question is, do you ever encounter that in social settings with family, friends, with this new political kind of society that we have? And if so, how do you respond in those situations?
People are always nice to you in person. It's easier for them to be assholes anonymously.
Yeah.
Yes. That's the answer. It is.
Hi, my name is Princess Streeter. Having a great time tonight. Thank you all for coming out. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to Christine and Bob. You all's sentiments on Jemele Hill taking to the studio and to the network rather than social media. I just have a question on how effective that would actually be, because while it caused a firestorm with her calling Trump a white supremacist, she was actually suspended after her critique of Jerry Jones and the sponsorships as a way of change. So taking that to the network, and we know how important sponsorships and viewership and advertisement is to the cash machine that is big media networks, how effective or how receptive would the network have been to her actually going on air and saying saying similar sentiments?
Well, I actually thought about if I had written a column on that topic, I absolutely could have written a column on that topic. Now, it's different when you're working for a newspaper like USA Today, a news organization like USA Today that's not a rights holder, right? So you've gone right to the issue of advertisers. But I think that Jemele could have done that on her show, and again, had a very intelligent 5 to 10 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever she wanted to do on that topic. I don't know if you were getting at this with the idea of the immediacy of Twitter, but that tweet is all powerful, isn't it? It just hits and it's easy to read, and anyone's tweet on any topic. Obviously, what she could have done is, of course, had the link then to that 3, 5 minute, 10-minute segment, put that on Twitter. But I'm old school on this. I don't tweet very much, and what I tweet is basically, it's like a bulletin board is the way I look at Twitter. So I understand what she was doing. I know everyone else, I'm sure, has an opinion on it. I'm a huge fan of Jemele's. Her voice is so important, especially now, that I hated to lose it for 2 weeks. And, of course, the employer does have the opportunity to make that decision. And so I just want to hear her all the time. And I hate that whatever it was, whether we can argue all day, whether it was deserving of a 2-week suspension or it wasn't, I hate that that happened because we need her desperately to be speaking out all the time.
Can I just jump in for a second? You don't have to ask this in the hypothetical. I'm very critical of Donald Trump on our show all the time, on the same network that Jemele works for. About 30 minutes before she goes on, I've been critical. I've wrote a column for The Undefeated. Same network, same employer, in which there was pretty strong language used about my position and reflects our position, if you will. So it's not unprecedented. I don't even know our social media policy. To tell you the truth, I'm not concerned with it. I say what I'm going to say on our air. And by the way, it wasn't never is it long but it's said. It may be between the commas 4 or 5, 6, 8 different times since November 6th.
You know
I've
the
never been
policy
called.
now.
No, I don't.
Well, the policy's got to be, didn't they tell all employees of ESPN?
You ever talked to anybody about social media?
No.
No. No. So it's not, you don't have to go to the hypothetical.
You don't think everybody at ESPN now knows we can't do that?
What does do that mean? I just told you I did.
Which he just did.
What?
But there's other stuff, too.
There's
not just the one issue.
What can't you do? You can't be critical? Really? Because then you better take the column I wrote down.
Christine said,
Excuse
yes,
me.
go ahead.
My question was more so posed to, she said that the best way to ignite change is to attack the pockets of the people who are the change makers. So being more, aside from Donald Trump, which I know is, like you said, unprecedented, when you would say attacking the sponsors and the people who can make the changes and have the conversations for the things that the protesters and the NFL players are standing up for, not many people are critical of that, and I think that was where the precedent kind of begins.
I thought that was a good comment on her part. It's a pertinent comment. I don't think it's an incendiary or personally insulting comment. It's a legitimate comment, but I agree with Christine's point that Jamel has a better place to make it than on Twitter, but I would use Twitter to say, here are my comments about the NFL, its business partners, about Donald Trump tomorrow on my program with Michael Smith, and then once she does it, I'd link to it. I think that's the best combination of uses.
Okay, yes.
My question is for Mr. Costas, but I wanted to paraphrase it first by telling him I grew up in Arnold, Missouri, a working-class suburb of St. Louis, and I want to thank you for all the great memories you gave me as a kid listening on Camel X. I'll never forget your call of Freddie Lewis's jumper that beat the New York Nets and Dr. J. I had the radio. I was 8 years old and had the radio tucked up to my ear. And I yelled to my dad, who was in the front room, "Oh, the Spirits won," and stuff like that. And I'll never forget that. And you gave me many of those, so I want to thank you for that.
Don't you feel incredibly old?
And I'm now 51.
I do. I hasten to add I was only 22 years old. But it was 1975, though.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was great and even better on radio, I think. And I even talked to you once on Sports Open Line, going back that far. So, but my question is that some of the most insightful interviews and reporting I'm hearing today are on podcasts, both in news and sports. So my question to you is, with your knowledge and your interview ability, when are you going to have a podcast?
I've been thinking about it, and it gives you the freedom, it gives you the opportunity for depth. It's worthwhile, but you also want to make sure that you can present it in such a way and you have the kind of backing so that people know where to find it. You don't want to be talking to 412 people. You want a large enough audience that it has an impact. But I agree with you that it's a very interesting form that people are taking advantage of in creative and entertaining and often insightful ways.
Tony, have you changed at all since the podcast?
Well, I make less money. I walked away from a radio deal and I make less money. I enjoy it very much.
Yeah, but you did that for the freedom.
Yeah, I no longer wanted to work for somebody else. I wanted to work for myself. I was at a position in life where I could do that. I took what was my radio show and made it into a podcast, and it's different. Most podcasts are not daily. You know, some are. Mine is, and we get about 160, 170,000 people who download it every day, which is very good.
That's real good.
But it's the radio show format. I have all the freedom I want, but you know what? I also tell the people on it, we're not going to curse. We're not going to do anything there somebody can say, well, don't listen to this show because of this. We have politics, we have sports, we have music and entertainment. We have all of those things with a rotating cast of people. Mike is on every Monday screaming at me about something. And I enjoy it very much. And you feel as if you can say whatever you want because you're the one out there. You're on the line. Nobody is coming to you and saying, you can't say that and we're going to dock you pay or we're going to suspend you. And having been suspended in all forms of media in my life, I seek to avoid that at this point.
Yes.
Hi. You've been talking about how You've been talking about how football could potentially collapse over the next couple decades. If that happens, do you think a different sport might take its place, like surge in popularity, to fill that void?
Well, I think everybody is still waiting for soccer, right? And guess what? I mean, I think the numbers are up with soccer. I think it's on the rise, and I think it's now been taken into, if it's not a major sport, it's on its way to being a major sport.
The critical thing with soccer is American viewers being able to see the best soccer in the world, with apologies to MLS. That we want to watch the best thing in the world, whatever that is.
Yeah, and I think NBC's done a great job with the Premier League.
And that's just it. You can now see the Premier League, you can see Bundesliga, you can see, you can see the best in the world of this thing. Now, your question, is anything going to attract 35 to 40 million of us at one time again? Not in my lifetime. And that's what we're talking about. The pro football attracted numbers that on a weekly basis hadn't happened only in this country since the Beverly Hillbillies. In the wake of, seriously, in the wake of the death of the assassination of President Kennedy. You don't have people crowding around TVs in different places, not to mention the 35 to 40 million is a short change, because they don't count bars, and they don't count dorms, they don't count all these places. Who knows? I'm not going to say it's twice as many, but it's probably north of 45 million. Tony and I talk about this all the time. What else is going to galvanize people like that? Nothing that we have now. So you better be able to see around corners to figure out what that is.
Soccer has a lot of problems. The main problem, it seems to me, is betting. It's hard to get a line on a soccer game. One of the things that's very attractive about football is the betting. There's fantasy football because of the betting. And it's just harder with soccer.
You know why? Because the over-under in soccer is
One.
0.5
Yeah.
or 1. Right.
Yeah.
Well, and
you know,
also...
it's interesting. Gary McCord, the golf announcer, says golf is dead unless you can bet. He thinks that there should be a whole betting apparatus for golf.
Well, you can bet on the course. Everybody bets on the course.
There's fantasy golf leagues.
Yeah,
where you go through an entire tournament and you pick out 6 people and the numbers, in relation to
He
par.
says that's the only thing that's going to save golf.
But, your question's really interesting about where we're headed with some of these sports over the next 20, 30 years. You just mentioned golf. The demographics for golf right now are death. I mean, if you don't start getting women who've played sports, millions of girls and women playing sports because of Title IX now in their 20s and 30s, want to play sports their whole lives, disposable income, yet they're not going to play golf. Some are, but not the way they're going to run marathons or do soccer leagues or whatever. So there's that piece of it. And the next 4 years are going to be tough for men's soccer because without the World Cup for the U.S., that's certainly a kick in the solar plexus.
Tony and Mike were saying that when they lost, that. Ooh, how about that contract?
Well, if you were Fox,
if you were
and
Fox,
you spent all that money and you don't even get the 3 automatic United States games, that's tough.
Or if you're Nike and you got that U.S. jersey you're trying to sell,
what are you doing?
It's going to be a little difficult.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Arthur Jones II. I'm a journalist and producer for CBS News Washington, and I also contributed a couple pieces to the undefeated ESPN. But aside from that, I'm a former athlete. 2016 was
Big
my
Ten,
last,
Big Ten.
2016, was my last year playing football, ironically, a Hoosier football program. And our last game was at Levi Stadium last year, the same exact stadium that Colin Kaepernick used to play with. So basically, will bringing forward any of these emails and documents from the owners actually do anything for him and actually get him back into the NFL? If not, what will? Because I've been asking this question at the last 6 months of journalism conferences, and everyone's telling me the same answer. So maybe you all
Which is what?
have a different
What do they
one.
say the answer is?
Well, Charles Barkley said it's all about power and money, and so the owners, they have all the power and they have all the money, so they can do what they want.
Look, we started asking this question on PTI last January. And Tony would turn to me and say, he's going to be back in the league, right? And I would say no, because they're going to collude. They're going to blacklist him. And he would ask me in February, in March, in April. And he would sometimes say, but he's going to be back by camp. And I would say, no, he's not. He's not ever coming back. And then for a while, I thought ever was a little strong. And I don't think ever's strong. They can't, proving collusion is really difficult.
You're going to need a smoking gun, email or emails. And there's so many people lined up that want to make it as concise as possible. Back in the 80s, the Major League Baseball Players Association, which is still the most powerful and effective of all the sports unions, and especially then, they were able to prove collusion against the owners because so many players were locked out. Good players, Tim Raines, Andre Dawson, really good players, could not find a place to play. It was so obvious. The owners weren't very deft about it. The Cubs, Andre Dawson wound up giving the Cubs a blank check, said, fill in anything you want. He was the MVP. They filled in $500,000, and he played for $500,000. It was an easier case to prove. Here, unless you've got a smoking gun of an email, they'll be able to say, most teams, Colin Kaepernick doesn't fit our system. He's not the player he once was. If it was Tim Tebow and he was able to be a backup quarterback in the league, the, quote, distractions that come with Tim Tebow would not make it worth it. And so for the same reason, nothing against Colin Kaepernick or his cause, they can say it isn't worth it for a backup quarterback. Whether we believe that or not, it's going to be, like Michael said, a tough case to prove.
Well, the other part of it is that most teams can say, we have people who kneel for the anthem, and they are on our teams. And so it makes it harder to make a case just for Colin Kaepernick without actual physical proof or phone records or something that says he's being singled out. So.
A footnote, though, kids in history class, if there are such things in 20, 30, 40 years, or holograms or whatever it's going to be that kids are learning, will study Colin Kaepernick in this time period. And Donald Trump ensured that when he crash-landed into this story in Huntsville, Alabama at the end of September and tried to divide the nation, and he brought it right back to the surface. And I think maybe some good things are going to come out, not so much for Kaepernick, but in terms of community involvement and the way the league is looking at these issues now. And as I said, again, I think he will be studied the way we look at Kurt Flood, the way we look, obviously, at people like Muhammad Ali, Billie Jean King, Jackie Robinson, as a major player in our cultural, social history because of this episode and the last year and a half.
Isn't it funny when people say to all of us, stick to sports? And so far as I'm aware, none of us has ever talked about any social issue or political issue unless it directly intersected with sports. But there are people who have no particular expertise about sports who talk about sports anytime they want, including the President of the United States, who changed the entire narrative of what the Kaepernick thing started out as. I apologize, and we'll get to this quickly. I think we ought to be able to make distinctions without people thinking that you're not in sympathy with the basic issue. What Colin Kaepernick started is about a real issue. And Colin Kaepernick himself has walked the walk, and every time I've ever talked about him, I've said that. He's involved in the community. He's raised money. He's taken his own money. I think his intentions are good. I think you're allowed to say, however, because you're allowed to look at each situation differently, that he's not the natural heir to Muhammad Ali or to Kurt Flood or to Arthur Ashe, because he's not equipped. He's gone radio silent, and when he does speak, he often says things that undermine his position. You can't
like
say,
I didn't vote.
Right, I didn't vote because the oppressor will never let you vote your way out of your oppression. So I guess it didn't matter that Barack Obama used to be president and now somebody else is president. Or you show up with socks that depict cops as pigs. Well, that ain't true of most, let alone all cops. We can make distinctions, and we can praise him and respect him for the good he's done, but not say that, hey, Muhammad Ali figuratively is handing the torch to him. To Doug Baldwin? Yeah. To Anquan Bolden? Maybe. To Malcolm Jenkins? Maybe. And throw a few white guys in, for God's sake. You know, that'd be good if they stood up and stood shoulder to shoulder. Not just with a hand on the shoulder, but had something to say.
But does he have to be Muhammad Ali or Arthur Ashe?
Well, the problem is,
he's done a good thing, but I just don't think he rises to that level of transcendence.
There's a couple of things
triggered
here.
The conversation.
It's like Bob said. I just said to Tony today, and I've been saying this for weeks. He's an unfortunate messenger in a lot of ways. Through some fault of his own. You lose me as a 58-year-old black man in America when you say I didn't vote and you didn't recognize any distinction between the two candidates. Lost me. They're better. And by the way, all of this time, when you're a quarterback or even a former quarterback in the NFL, black, white, or otherwise, look at the platform you have. My God, you can get on any TV show in the world on Sunday because that's all shoulder to shoulder. Every set has at least 3 of them. So you have this platform, and you don't use it. You don't know how to use it. You're quiet. You're not particularly eloquent on the issue. What's my man on Seattle?
Doug Baldwin, Michael Bennett.
Michael Bennett. Michael Bennett said more in about an hour after determining what it is that his agenda was than Kaepernick has the entire 6-8 months. And so in this day, we're talking about social media, we're talking about platforms, talking about clicks and users and influencers. You have access to be all these things, and you haven't. So this is a really difficult thing. And I admire what he did, but he is not an ideal messenger, and not to be sort of confused with, I said today to Tony, this is not John Carlos and Tommy Smith.
Let's pledge to get to all these people. They've been waiting. Let's try.
Hi, guys. Thanks for coming out tonight. You began the night talking 15, 20 years ago, sports in the past and what it looked like then and how it's changed. I kind of wanted to ask about that same time frame in the future in the context of sports gambling and it potentially being legalized. Right now, it's just something that we heard Brent Musburger talked about his friends in the desert or something kind of, it's been a moot point.
Yeah.
Adam Silver has touched on it, basically saying the NBA isn't totally opposed to the topic. I wanted to ask you if you could see it 15, 20 years from now becoming legalized and how that would change, if at all, the landscape of sports, its integrity, other things of that nature, and also if it would change how it's covered. Thanks.
I think football has to go there in order to survive.
I think it gets legalized, the leagues take a cut, and the biggest question is not at the professional level because the salaries are large enough. The biggest question would be at the amateur level.
Yes.
I had 2 questions. I hope that's okay.
No. No, 2, sure.
Sure. So the first one was for Bob. You talk about...
Wait 1 second. Where's my wife going? Are you leaving? Are you stepping?
I'm getting the car.
Okay, thank you.
Isn't that what you want me to do?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Well, this will be the first and the last time I'm going to do what you want me to do.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
The marvelous Connie Chung.
Yeah.
So my first question was just for Bob. How you spoke about, I think we all agree how great the World Series was, but I'm just curious if you think there's a little bit of dilution with all the home runs and like the clear spike in home runs and runs scored, if you think that's good for the sport or you think that's a bad thing.
I think the bad thing is the absence of action. Home runs, strikeouts. When you have that many strikeouts, that also means even if the guy doesn't strike out, you got 2 and 2 counts, you got 3 and 1 counts, it goes deep. You like to see plays. You like to see artful double plays, relays from the outfield. You know what I think has been one of the good unintended consequences of the rule about not blocking the plate, which is designed just to spare injury to both the catcher and the runner, is that you get more picturesque plays at the plate, which you see from the overhead camera. You get these hook slides and sweep tags. It's very cool. People like to see that. The home run should be a punctuation. It should not be the only way you score. The extended rally, you know, the bunt, the steal, that kind of action, I think, is what's missing. But when you have bigger and stronger guys who are swinging with a certain upward launch angle, and you've got guys routinely throwing 95 to 100 and providing some of that, you know, it's just physics, some of that velocity, it's going to happen.
Yes.
Yeah, similar to my last guy's question about like the gambling. Clearly, like the law is a little bit behind like the popularity here in the States. I know SVP does a segment on his show. Wondering your thoughts, like just talking about it getting more mainstream, such as PTI, maybe in the Olympics, Bob.
PTI, no.
No, Wilbon hates
I
bad
hate
beats.
I hear
Hates bad
Tony
beats.
talking about.
I'm not a better.
He's-
I'm involved in the football pool every week, but I'm not a better. I don't care about it.
Tony
And
keeps
I don't-
talking about spreads, and Michael says, "I don't care about
Not the
spreads.
spread, I care
It's
about
who's
the
going to
competition.
win."
Not a betting show. No, so I can answer for PTI unless he's doing it with, I don't know, maybe he and Jamel will do the show.
Just real quick, Tony, also, my brother wanted me to ask you this. Are you, like, ashamed to admit that you're a Jets fan, or?
I was a Jets fan as a kid. I was not a Giants fan. People on Long Island tended to be Jets fans and not Giants fans, right?
Yep.
And I was a Jets fan then, but not so much anymore. Not so much anymore.
He's a Redskin fan.
I don't know. Maybe.
Right,
I've been here a long time, and the Jets stink. Like, let's be serious.
Something that you guys mentioned over and over again throughout this entire panel was the discussion of a lot of current events and how that's intersecting. And in fact, Bob, you mentioned that the intersection of how these current events are reaching what it is that you guys talk about on a regular basis. Do you think that the advent of social media had any impact on that? And as a result, forcing you guys to bring to the fore all of these issues as journalists and therefore reach out to more of the American public who normally would not speak to these events?
I always use my own judgment, but I'm sure that social media has an effect on everything. It just kind of increases the volume, and in some cases it adds insight. In most cases it just adds noise, but it does add insight on occasion. But I just go wherever my sense of the story takes me. And also, in network sports, you only get little narrow lanes. Michael and Tony have more time in a given show than I might have in a whole season. You're presenting the game more than covering the game or commenting on the game for the most part. I try, when I see these little spaces, I try to get it in there. But that's just my own judgment of what a story is. Social media doesn't have any effect on it.
But you were able to do it at the Olympics.
Yeah, sometimes. Not as often as I wished, but sometimes.
Well, and I would say on some of these big stories, actually social media probably has nothing to do with it in terms of what drives us. It's journalism. And so, again, when Donald Trump decides in Huntsville, Alabama, to use the term SOB and fire these guys, well, I'm actually sitting at CNN on Don Lemon's show, and we immediately went from Aaron Hernandez and the CTE thing, which was a horrible story as well, and a very quite a revelation about what his brain showed. We go right to Trump. So that had nothing to do with it. I'm sure it was going crazy on Twitter, but that's almost a byproduct for us, and it should be, frankly. If you're a journalist, you shouldn't be, trying to figure out which way the wind's going. People are these days. That's a shame. You should have the knowledge to be able to make those decisions for yourself and take that and run with it.
Okay,
Thanks.
we got two more. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm a huge fan of all yours. I want to say specifically I've been watching PTI since maybe I was in 6th grade when I got back from school every day. So I'm curious, I have a question for all of you. In your lifetimes of watching, so many different sports players, who do you think was the best sports player of your whole time?
I know who you're going to say.
No, you don't. By the way, real quickly for that last question, I want to go back to something for a second. I want to acknowledge a person I'm sure he's acknowledged before I got here, too. You talk about understanding cultural change and how it impacted sports every day. George Solomon did not need social media for that. The first column he had me write when I was 29 years old, he called me up. I was out to cover a Denver Broncos, Cleveland Browns AFC title game, and George said, "You're going to write a column." He made me a columnist that day, and I was going to write about Jimmy the Greek sitting in Washington, D.C., and saying something about the big black buck and the slave woman mating and having.
Yeah.
And George said, "You're going to sit down and compose yourself and write about this." It wasn't about a Redskin game. It wasn't about the Bullets. It was about something that meant a hell of a lot to a very different community of readers in Washington, D.C. than any place else. I think social media actually goes the other way too often. They want more analytics. They want to just keep the conversation narrow. No, people who've done this for a long time, and for me in my life, I credit George with this, with making me understand very early on what important stories were. What was the next? What we just
Your favorite athlete.
Favorite athlete or best athlete.
I mean, he's trying to make fun of me.
I'm not making fun of you.
I covered the career of Michael Jordan, the whole career, from first month in college to the end, which happened here in Washington. All of it. Had a front row seat for all of it. And so for me, I'm not going to argue. He always says, by the way, Jordan himself says, it is not me. I am not. There are a bunch of people who, I guess he and Russell always say, tied for first. And there are a bunch of people in that. I mean, Tony saw enough of Ali and knew Ali that if you want to say it's Muhammad Ali, I'm not going to argue and say, no, it's Michael Jordan. For me, it was Jordan because I'm of that age and I had that access. But there are probably a dozen people at least that I would have on any short list. What about you?
Yeah, no, but everybody has the same, that one of the things was, I don't know if they even have this in circulation anymore, that Sports Century series that Mark Shapiro did for ESPN, the top 50.
That was great.
And then everybody would have 45 of those people on the list. And, and then you would just jump around as to who you thought was the best. The late, great Dick Schaap always put Jim Brown. Jim Brown was number one. He competed against him in college in lacrosse and thought that Jim Brown was the greatest athlete of all time. I mean, but you'd get unanimity on 40 of the
Brown
50.
finished fourth. I think Jordan was one, Ruth was two, Ali was three, and Brown was four. But I would say this, just to help move things along. If the five of us drew up a list of 5 athletes we have seen, for sure, the only one name that would appear on all 5 is Michael Jordan. So I think we would go with that.
Absolutely. And then certainly a guy named Tiger and a woman named Serena would have to be right up there as well.
Okay.
Yes.
I think one of the major trends,
because we got to get through these people.
One of the major trends in sports the last few years, especially in basketball and even in football with the Browns and the Jets failing at it this year, is trying to avoid the treadmill of mediocrity, either totally throwing away your season, opening up cap space for the future and getting a lot of draft picks, or throwing all of your resources at a championship this year, and we'll see what happens next year. I think we've even seen the Wizards do that 3 or 4 years in a row now. Can you guys just talk about how the gap in competitiveness in the leagues might affect TV viewership and the overall interest in sports as they are?
Let's make it brief. National viewership is not that affected because in the NBA, people are not showing, I'm not demeaning them, but they're not showing the Hawks against the Grizzlies, even though those are pretty good teams. The national games are all a handful of teams. The national games in baseball are all a handful of teams. The NFL is different because it's just one game a week, and you have pockets of local fandom, and then you have a big game at 4 o'clock and a big game on Sunday night. I think that the bigger question is, do you go the Houston Astros, Chicago Cub route, which is to say we're going to suck for a while, but it's a path to being good? That's what the White Sox are now trying to do. There's probably Jet fans that are upset that they're 4-5 instead of 1-8 because they might just be just mediocre enough to get like the 11th pick instead of the 2nd pick, which isn't going to help them very much.
Okay. We've got 5 people. Quickly.
Lightning round.
All right. First of all, just wanted to thank you guys for your time. This is directed at Mike. You had a Twitter exchange on Sunday where you tweeted about a Josh Norman hit. He quote tweeted it. He quote tweeted it, and then Dan Steinberg retweeted it, which in this case, as a post writer, essentially appears to be an endorsement. You talked earlier about how sports writers have no shame. If you
No, I meant we as a culture have no shame.
We as a culture, okay,
Not
fair.
sports writers.
Even better. So in that case, do you feel that whether you were in Steinberg's shoes or just generally, there's no shame in calling out your peers like that? And is there an assumed civility to those interactions? Like, are you expected to own up to when you oppose your peers? Or are you expected to?
I don't pay any attention. I don't even know where. I just saw Steinberg Friday night at the Wizards game. I don't know who retweets anything. I don't follow retweets. I thought Josh Norman should have been thrown out of the game, and that's what I say. And so I don't have any idea. No, I don't owe anybody else anything when it comes to my comment. Mine will be based on, 38 years of covering pro football, or about 35 of them. So, no, I thought he should have been thrown out of the game, and I don't give any weight to what anybody might have to say or retweet.
Yeah, thank you.
In light of the Louisville and the other NCAA college basketball scandal and the ruling on
North Carolina with the NCAA. What effect do you think that's going to have on the future in the short term of NCAA basketball?
Jump in there, Mr. Tony.
I don't think it's going to have any effect. Louisville's going to get a lot worse, and the other teams, Duke and Kentucky, and the other teams are going to be fine. This is a big business, college basketball. Some of us looked at this and wondered why the FBI was involved in this, how it even got to that. What it showed clearly was that the NCAA itself has absolutely no power.
One former college coach told me, we've known this for 30 years.
It's been going
or
on.
more.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things. You can never make it perfect, but there's a few things. Number one, this one and done is going to shortly be done.
Yeah.
You should be allowed to go. There's no disgrace if you're a hockey player or a baseball player. You don't have to go to college. And the NBA will have to set up developmental leagues. And you should be allowed to go back to college if you don't make it there. However, they should go back to the old freshman ineligible rule. Give you 5 years of eligibility, but as a freshman, if you're at Syracuse, you don't travel around the world or play in Hawaii. You play Canisius. You play Cornell. You play their freshman team. And you have to prove that you're at least a minimally acceptable student while you were there, and then you can play as a sophomore. And especially in basketball, the rosters are small enough that you could have a special designee of the chancellor vet every admission. Just that simple. You have to be able to be admitted to the school and plausibly be a student if it had no basketball program. You can't play varsity. You can only play freshman. You get at least a 5-year scholarship. And you can also just go to the NBA without ever setting foot in college. Those things would not correct everything, but they take a lot of the sham out of it.
Yes.
This question's directed at Bob. With the sabermetric route coming into the Major League Baseball and even in other sports, what's your opinion on the sabermetric route where guys are putting Giancarlo Stanton up on the second hole instead of the fourth hole traditionally, for example?
I don't have any problem with it. I think you want all the information that you can possibly get your hands on. Every team and every sport now has an analytics department, but it's not the be-all and end-all. I think Joe Torre put it well some years ago when he reminded Brian Cashman this game has a heartbeat. And so the analysis matters, but the coach, the teammates, the manager knows what the feel of the clubhouse is on a given day. And even if analytics indicate that this pitcher isn't any good after 100 pitches, generally speaking, on that particular night, your instincts might tell you he's got his best stuff ever tonight. And I'm not going to just do what it says on this sheet of paper. I'm going to go with my gut. I don't think there's anything wrong with blending the two, but you'd be crazy in the 21st century to ignore analytics.
Yes.
Hey guys, I'll be quick. With the decline of cable, do you see sports shows like PTI only existing on streaming and or digital platforms? Do you think there will be a day where original content won't be on cable and they'll only be on these platforms and that will be seen at a majority?
I can tell you from the right side of this table, we are way too old. And you have to, when I say old, here's what I mean. We refer to this all the time on his podcast and on our television show. You know what streaming is to me? It's punching the goddamn on button. That's what streaming is. Turn it on, watch it. I watch television. I have satellite. I'm not streaming anything. I am not going to take my time to stream something when I can click on. So that's something that fascinates you guys. Oh, we can cut the cord. I'm not cutting anything. I'm plugging into as much stuff as I can plug into.
I really hope there are more people like you. I want to go into TV producing. So
That's good. That's good to hear. So I can speak for Tony. Trust me. We don't stream jack, all right? I'm going to go home tonight. I'm going to hit a DVR button. I'm going to watch the end of the Suits summer series. I'm going to watch some Law & Order SVU. And I'm not going to stream anything or watch anything on a 2-inch screen. So whatever that means.
As you get older and older, streaming has a different connotation.
Thanks, guys.
Very good. All right, last question.
Last question, I feel special. How's everybody doing tonight? So, my name is Arize. I have a company called More Than Basketball here in the D.C. area. I did a documentary on the rise and fall of a notable AAU organization called DC Assault. I'm sure you guys are familiar, Curtis Malone and Troy Weaver and all these guys that were involved. Delonte Hill, who's here at Maryland at one point in time, was a coach there. So my question is, you know, you had, Mr. Costas, you just spoke on everything you want to do to like regulate college basketball. But if there's guys out there, which this stuff is detailed in the documentary, it's called Assault on Assault, the rise and fall of DC Assault. But for those of you who, for anybody who knows the business, you know there's guys who are with kids from 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade. So who cares if they have to wait an extra year or two for a JV farm system or whatever before they already invested from these kids being in middle school or as soon as they sign up on the top-ranked 2-year-old. So why does that even matter if they have to wait an extra year or two? That's almost irrelevant. So it's basically unregulatable, basically.
The point you're making, I agree with. However, if you want to eliminate the sham of somebody who's not a legitimate student representing a university, and that person should just go play professional basketball, what I suggested is one way to do that. It's not a way to eliminate the agents almost from cradle to grave. Right. I don't have an answer for that.
Because those guys aren't going anywhere. The money's too long, and the promise of the LeBron James $100 million, $300 million. I mean, there's marginal players getting that. So if you can find you a marginal player in the 7th grade, who cares? I'll wait an extra year, and then I'll be in his pocket anyway. So it's like you can't really do anything.
But you might be in his pocket in a developmental league and not at LSU or Ohio State or North Carolina.
That's true, but then I'll be in Adidas' pocket while he's there. So it's like,
yeah, well, there you go. I think I speak for all of us here. Thank you for being such an attentive and intelligent audience with your questions. And I'm going to make a leap and think I'm speaking for all of us here. Some of you have undoubtedly made videos on your cell phones. You can tweet. You can blurb. Please do it in context. Please don't take us out of context. Please don't take the most incendiary thing and misrepresent the overall of what we said. That may be a vain hope, but it's my hope.
I want to thank Christine, who's given so much to the Povich Center and so much to the Merrill College. She's out here a lot. I thank her very much. Michael and Tony are very busy people. They do me the honor of being here. And Bob has come all the way from New York, and I thank him very much. And thank you all.
Thank you, Maury.
You're a great crowd.
Thank you, Maury.
Thank you.
And there you have it.
Well, that was great, and I could feel you several times agreeing with the thing about doing on the show and all that. That was great. That's fantastic. Yeah. We've got to be able to say that to each other.
Peter,
So I'm going to probably stay out here and talk to